After I refused to pay for my sister's $80,000 wedding, she invited me to a casual dinner. 3 lawyers were waiting with documents. She said, "Sign this or I will ruin you," and I said, "Meet my wife." What she handed them shut everything down. My name is Maya. I am 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my family has been obsessed with the illusion of Black excellence. Before I dive into exactly how I dismantled their fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to set fire to toxic family expectations to build your own peace. If there were a camera in my living room right now, it would be slowly panning across the space, gliding past the floor to ceiling windows that overlook the glittering Atlanta skyline, before slowly pushing in on me, sitting comfortably in this leather chair. I am finally at peace. But getting to this beautiful, quiet life meant walking through an absolute nightmare orchestrated by the people who shared my blood. The reality of what went down in that VIP room in Buckhead last month was as cold and hard as the marble table we sat around. It started with a text message from my younger sister, Chloe. She was the undisputed golden child of our family, the one who did everything right according to my parents. She joined the right sorority, attended the right galas, and smiled perfectly for the society pages. I was the black sheep. I dropped out of law school at 19 because my passion was in technology and coding. My parents, Marcus and Vivian, were horrified. To them, I was throwing away the family prestige. They cut me off entirely and literally threw my bags out onto the driveway. For over a decade, I built my life from scratch while they paraded Chloe around Atlanta high society. So when Chloe texted me asking for a casual dinner to catch up and talk about her upcoming wedding, I should have known better. I should have recognized the trap. But a small, foolish part of me still hoped that maybe, just maybe, my sister actually wanted to reconnect. I agreed to meet her at a notoriously exclusive French restaurant in the heart of Buckhead. I arrived 10 minutes early wearing a simple but perfectly tailored silk dress. The maitre d' greeted me with a practiced smile and led me past the ambient lighting and soft jazz of the main dining room. We walked down a long, dimly lit hallway toward the back of the restaurant. As the heavy oak door to the private VIP room swung open, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The room was stark quiet and completely devoid of the casual dinner vibe I was promised. There was no food on the table. There were no menus. There was only a chilling, calculated ambush. Sitting at the center of the long marble table was Chloe, her arms crossed, wearing a smug expression that made my stomach turn. Next to her was her fiancé, Trent. He was a white guy from a family that claimed to have generations of old money. He loved to use his supposed pedigree to act superior to everyone, frequently flaunting a lifestyle he thought made him untouchable. On Chloe's other side sat my parents. My mother, Vivienne, was clutching her signature pearls, looking at me with that familiar mixture of disdain and embarrassment she had perfected over the years. My father, Marcus, sat with his chest puffed out, radiating a toxic authority. But it was the 3 men standing behind them that made the air in the room freeze. They were dressed in sharp, identical gray suits, clutching thick leather briefcases. Lawyers. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the heavy oak door close behind me with a soft click. No one offered a greeting. No one asked how my day was. "Sit down, Maya," my father ordered, using the exact same tone he used when I was a teenager in trouble. I walked slowly to the opposite end of the table and took a seat, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I looked at the 3 strangers in suits, then at my sister. "What is this, Chloe?" Chloe did not even have the decency to look ashamed. She slid a thick, bound legal document across the smooth marble surface. It stopped right in front of me. "That is an authorization of asset transfer," Chloe said, her voice dripping with entitlement. "You are going to sign it tonight. It allows our legal team to leverage your little software business to secure an $80,000 line of credit. I need the funds released by tomorrow morning for my wedding vendors." I stared at her, genuinely wondering if she had lost her mind. "You want me to mortgage my business to pay for your wedding?" My mother slammed her hand down on the table, her diamond rings catching the harsh overhead light. "Do not act so ungrateful, Maya. You have owed this family for years. You brought nothing but shame to our name when you dropped out of school. Chloe is marrying into a prominent family. She is securing our legacy. You are going to do your part and fund this wedding, or so help me, you will regret it. I looked over at Trent. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cuffs with an arrogant smirk. Listen, Maya, he said, his tone incredibly patronizing. In my world, family takes care of family. I know you do not understand the pressures of elite social circles, but Chloe deserves a wedding that reflects my family's status. Consider this an investment in your own redemption. You sign the paper, and maybe I will find a low-level tech support job for you at my father's investment firm. It took everything in me not to burst out laughing right then and there. Trent was lecturing me about elite status, completely unaware that I had watched his credit card get declined 3 times at the front bar when I walked into the restaurant. I am not signing anything, I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. I do not owe you a dime, Chloe, and I certainly do not owe this family my business. That is when the lead lawyer in the gray suit stepped forward. He unclasped his briefcase with a loud snap that echoed in the quiet room. Ms. Williams. He began, his voice practiced and intimidating. If you refuse to sign this collateral agreement, we have been instructed by your parents to file a comprehensive lawsuit against your company by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. We will bury you in frivolous litigation. We will freeze your business accounts, petition for emergency injunctions, and tie you up in court until your legal fees bankrupt your tiny startup. You will lose your business, your apartment, and everything you have built. Chloe leaned forward, her eyes flashing with a vicious delight. Sign the document, Maya. Sign it, or I swear I will let them ruin you. You will be back on the street, exactly where you belong. The silence that followed was suffocating. My parents watched me eagerly, waiting for the inevitable moment when the rebellious daughter would finally break. They expected me to cry. They expected me to panic, to beg for mercy, to apologize for being difficult. They still saw me as the frightened 19-year-old girl they had discarded. They honestly believed they held all the power in this room. I looked down at the thick legal document sitting in front of me. I looked at the signature line waiting for my submission. Then I looked up at Chloe, meeting her arrogant gaze with a chilling, absolute calm. I reached out and picked up the crystal glass of ice water they had set at my place. The ice clinked softly as I brought it to my lips. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the tension in the room stretch until it was practically humming. I set the glass down gently. I picked up the heavy silver Mont Blanc pen the lawyer had placed next to the contract. I rolled the expensive metal between my fingers, feeling its weight. My father leaned forward, a satisfied smirk spreading across his face. Good girl, he muttered. Finally doing something useful for this family. I smiled. But I did not uncap the pen. I did not move toward the signature line. Instead, I flipped the pen in my hand, gripping it tightly like a dagger. With a sudden, violent downward motion, I drove the metal tip of the pen straight through the center of the thick stack of paper. The sharp crunch of tearing paper and scratching marble echoed like a gunshot. The pen stood straight up, pinning their ridiculous demands right to the table. The sharp sound of cracking plastic and tearing paper hung in the dead silence of the VIP room. The lead lawyer yanked his hands back as if the table had caught fire, staring at the ruined document pinned to the marble. Chloe let out a high-pitched gasp, her hands flying to her mouth, completely horrified that someone had finally dared to say no to her. Are you out of your mind? Chloe shrieked, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling as she pointed at the pen jutting out of the contract. Do you have any idea what you just did? I saved you the trouble of reading my rejection, I replied, my voice steady, not breaking eye contact with her. Before Chloe could launch into another tantrum, a heavy sigh echoed from her right. Trent pushed his chair back. The legs scraped aggressively against the hardwood floor. He stood up, towering over the table, buttoning the jacket of his navy suit with a slow, deliberate motion. He looked at me the way a disappointed teacher looks at a slow student. He possessed that specific brand of arrogant confidence that only comes from a lifetime of never being told no, fueled by a fake pedigree he wore like a crown. Maya, Trent said, shaking his head slowly. He placed his palms flat on the marble table, leaning over to invade my space. He was trying to cast a shadow over me, trying to make me feel small. You really do not get it, do you? You have spent so much time playing computer games in your little startup bubble that you have completely lost touch with how the real world operates. He looked over at my parents, offering them a sympathetic, patronizing smile. A smile that said, "I am so sorry you have to deal with this unruly child. Let the man handle it." My father actually nodded back at him. It made my blood boil, but I kept my face perfectly still. "Let me explain something to you, Trent," continued, turning his gaze back down to me. "Chloe and I are not just throwing a party. We are merging two worlds. My family has been in this country's financial sector for 4 generations. We have hospital wings named after us. We are members of clubs that do not even have websites. By marrying Chloe, I am elevating this entire family. I am giving the Williams name access to rooms in Atlanta that your parents could only dream of cleaning 30 years ago." I saw my mother flinch slightly at the word cleaning, but she immediately swallowed her pride and looked away. She was so desperate for proximity to whiteness and old money that she was willing to let this mediocre man insult her right to her face. "You should be thanking me," Trent sneered, his voice growing louder, echoing off the mahogany-paneled walls. "I am bringing actual class to this family, something you clearly lack. You sit there in your cheap dress, stabbing legal documents like a petulant child while we are offering you a seat at the adult table. We are asking for a measly $80,000. To my family, that is a rounding error. To you, it is apparently the end of the world because your little tech hobby is probably underwater. I know how you minority founders operate. Lots of flashy social media posts, zero actual revenue." The 3 lawyers behind him nodded in unison like obedient lapdogs. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the silence stretch. I did not yell. I did not defend my company. I just looked at him. I looked at the slight fraying on the stitching of his lapel. I looked at the tiny beads of sweat forming on his upper lip despite the air conditioning blasting in the room. I looked at a man who was drowning and trying to pull my family down with him. "A rounding error," I repeated softly, tasting the words. "Exactly," Trent scoffed, crossing his arms. "So drop the attitude, ask the gentleman for a fresh copy of the contract and sign it, or I will personally ensure my father's firm blacklists your company from every venture capital round on the East Coast." I tilted my head, studying him with genuine amusement. If $80,000 is just a rounding error to the almighty Blackwood family, Trent, then why are you begging the black sheep of your fiancé's family to mortgage her business to pay for your wedding cake? Trent's jaw tightened. "I am not begging. I am offering you an opportunity. My assets are currently tied up in long-term trusts. It is a liquidity issue. You would not understand complex wealth management." "A liquidity issue," I said, letting a soft, mocking laugh escape my lips. "That is a very elegant way of saying you are broke." Chloe slammed her hands on the table. "Shut your mouth, Maya. How dare you speak to him like that? Trent's family is worth millions." "Are they?" I asked, shifting my gaze to my sister. "Because I find that fascinating. You see, when I arrived at this restaurant 15 minutes ago, I did not come straight to this room. I stopped at the main bar to get a sparkling water. And while I was waiting, I happened to witness a very interesting interaction between the bartender and a man trying to open a tab for a private VIP room." Trent's face suddenly went rigid. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a tight, panicked mask. He took a quick step back from the table. "The man at the bar was throwing a fit." I continued, my voice steady and clear, projecting across the room so the lawyers could hear every single word. He was shouting at the bartender, demanding to know why his card was declined. The bartender, who was very polite, ran it a second time. Declined. So the man pulled out another card, a heavy metal titanium American Express. He slapped it on the counter, bragging about his limitless balance. The bartender ran it. Declined. "Stop talking," Trent ordered, his voice suddenly lacking its previous boom. It was a security freeze. "I was traveling last week." I ignored him, keeping my eyes locked on Chloe. Her face was slowly losing its color. The bartender ran it a third time, Chloe. 3 times. And then the bartender handed the titanium card back and said, "I am sorry, sir, but the terminal says this account has been suspended for delinquency." Please provide another form of payment or I will have to call the manager. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, staring directly up at Trent. Tell me, Trent, did you ever manage to open that tab? Or are we sitting in this room drinking tap water? Because you literally could not afford to order us a round of appetizers. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vent. The three lawyers shifted uncomfortably on their feet, exchanging nervous glances. They were hired to execute a legal shakedown, but even they recognized the smell of a broke client. Trent's face turned a violent shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff white collar. He pointed a trembling finger at me. You are a liar. You are a bitter, jealous, pathetic liar. Check his wallet, Chloe, I said calmly. Ask him to pull out the titanium Amex ending in 4108 and call the number on the back right now. Put it on speakerphone. Let us hear what the automated system says about his limitless wealth. Chloe looked at Trent, her eyes wide with a sudden creeping doubt. Trent, she whispered. Trent, just show her. Show her the account app on your phone and shut her up. Trent did not reach for his phone. He did not reach for his wallet. Instead, he slammed both fists down on the marble table, shaking the glasses. I do not have to prove anything to this trash, he roared, his voice cracking with unhinged fury. He turned toward the heavy oak door. That is it. I am done playing nice with your ghetto family, Chloe. I am getting the manager. I am having security drag this lying piece of garbage out of the restaurant right now. Trent spun around, practically sprinting toward the door to escape the room. The moment he moved, my parents erupted. But they did not attack Trent for his blatant racism. They did not attack him for disrespecting their daughter. They turned their blind, desperate rage entirely on me. Look what you did, my mother shrieked, jumping up from her chair and pointing at me as if I had committed a murder. You are ruining your sister's future. You are ruining our family. My father slammed his hand against the wall, his face twisted with anger. You have always been a jealous, spiteful little girl, Maya. Trent is giving Chloe the world, and you are trying to destroy it because you have nothing. You are going to apologize to him right now, and you are going to sign that paper, or I will make sure you never step foot in Atlanta again. The room descended into absolute chaos. My mother was hyperventilating, clutching Chloe. My father was shouting over the noise. Trent had his hand on the brass doorknob, screaming for the restaurant staff. The three lawyers were scrambling to gather their scattered, torn documents, realizing this shakedown had gone horribly wrong. I sat perfectly still in the center of the storm, watching the pathetic crumbling of their elite facade. I checked the diamond watch on my wrist. It was exactly 8:15. Right on time. Before Trent could pull the door open, the brass handle turned from the outside. The heavy oak door swung inward with such force that Trent had to stumble backward to avoid getting hit in the face. The screaming in the room died instantly. Everyone froze, staring at the doorway. The sharp sound of cracking plastic and tearing paper hung in the dead silence of the VIP room. The lead lawyer yanked his hands back as if the marble table had suddenly caught fire, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Chloe let out a high-pitched, strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth in absolute horror. She was completely unaccustomed to anyone daring to defy her, let alone violently destroying the very instrument of her demands. A heavy, exasperated sigh echoed from across the table. Trent pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. He stood up slowly, deliberately, using his towering height to his advantage. From where I sat, the angle forced me to look up at him while he loomed over me, casting a long, imposing shadow across the ruined contract. He buttoned the jacket of his tailored navy suit with a slow, practiced motion, projecting an air of aristocratic patience being sorely tested. He looked down his nose at me, his expression perfectly capturing the condescension of a man who believed his mere presence in our company was an act of extreme charity. Maya, Trent said, shaking his head with a slow, theatrical display of pity. He placed his palms flat on the cold marble surface, leaning forward to invade my space, clearly attempting to physically intimidate me into submission. You really do not understand how the real world operates, do you? You have spent so much time isolated in your little startup bubble, playing at being an entrepreneur, that you have completely lost touch with reality. He turned his gaze toward my parents, offering them a sympathetic, patronizing smile that made my stomach turn. I apologize you have to witness this, his look seemed to say, positioning himself as the mature patriarch dealing with an unruly child. My father sickeningly nodded back at him in quiet agreement. Let me explain something to you, Maya. Trent continued, returning his cold blue gaze to me. Chloe and I are not just throwing a party. We are merging two entirely different worlds. My family has been a cornerstone of this country's financial sector for 4 generations. We have hospital wings bearing our name. We are legacy members of the Piedmont Driving Club and sit on the board of the Symphony. By marrying Chloe, I am lifting your family out of obscurity. I am providing the Williams name with a level of societal access, a cultural refinement in Atlanta that your parents could only dream of achieving on their own. The sheer audacity of his words hung heavily in the air. He was blatantly weaponizing his white old money privilege, positioning himself as the great savior of our black family. And the most tragic part was that my parents were eating it up. My mother clutched her pearls, looking at Trent with sheer adoration, completely willing to overlook his thinly veiled insults about our family's background in exchange for the proximity to his supposed elite pedigree. I am bringing actual generational class to this family, Trent sneered, his voice growing louder, echoing off the mahogany-paneled walls. A pedigree that you clearly lack. You sit there in your off-the-rack dress stabbing legal documents like a petulant, uneducated child, while we are graciously offering you a seat at the adult table. We are asking for a measly $80,000. To my family, that is a simple rounding error. To you, it is apparently an insurmountable fortune because your little tech hobby is likely drowning in debt. I know exactly how you minority founders operate. Lots of flashy social media posts about empowerment, but zero actual revenue or business acumen to back it up. The 3 lawyers standing behind him nodded in unison, a synchronized display of spineless corporate obedience. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply remained seated, letting the silence stretch out and forcing the dynamic of the room to pivot. I kept my face perfectly still, projecting an aura of absolute, unbothered calm that forced the metaphorical perspective to shift. I was no longer the small subject being looked down upon. I was the one holding the power, looking up at him with unblinking scrutiny. I let my eyes slowly travel over him, examining the slight fraying on the stitching of his lapel, the unnatural stiffness of his posture, and the tiny beads of sweat forming on his upper lip, despite the cool air conditioning blasting in the VIP room. I was no longer looking up at a towering figure of generational wealth. I was dissecting a desperate fraud. A rounding error, I repeated softly, letting the words roll off my tongue, tasting their baseless arrogance. Exactly, Trent scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest to feign authority. So drop the rebellious attitude, ask the gentleman for a fresh copy of the authorization agreement, and sign it. Or I will personally ensure my father's firm blacklists your little company from every venture capital round on the East Coast. You will never secure a dime of funding again. I tilted my head, studying him with genuine, undisguised amusement. If $80,000 is merely a rounding error to the almighty Blackwood dynasty, Trent, then I am incredibly confused. Why exactly are you begging the black sheep of your fiancé's family to mortgage her business just to pay for your wedding cake? Trent's jaw tightened instantly. The confident mask slipped just a fraction. I am not begging anyone for anything. I am offering you an opportunity to prove your loyalty to this family. My personal assets are currently tied up in long-term high-yield trusts. It is a temporary liquidity issue, something you would not understand lacking any experience with complex wealth management. A liquidity issue, I said, letting a soft, mocking laugh escape my lips. That is a very elegant country club way of saying you are broke. Chloe slammed her hands on the table, her face contorting with rage. Shut your mouth, Maya. How dare you speak to him like that? Trent's family is worth tens of millions. Are they? I asked, shifting my unwavering gaze to my sister, because I find that absolutely fascinating. You see, Chloe, when I arrived at this restaurant 20 minutes ago, I did not come straight to this dining room. I stopped at the main bar to order a sparkling water, and while I was waiting for my drink, I happened to witness a very interesting interaction between the bartender and a man trying to open a tab for a private VIP room. Trent's face suddenly went rigid. The arrogant flushed color drained from his cheeks entirely, leaving him a sickly pale white. He took a quick involuntary step back from the marble table. The man at the bar was throwing quite the temper tantrum. I continued, my voice steady and clear, projecting across the room so the lawyers could hear every single syllable. He was aggressively tapping his fingers on the bar, shouting at the bartender, demanding to know why his card had been declined for a simple bottle of champagne. The bartender, who maintained excellent professional composure, ran it a second time. Declined again. So the man, sweating profusely and swearing loudly about banking errors, pulled out another card, a heavy metal titanium American Express. He slapped it on the mahogany counter, loudly bragging to everyone within earshot about his limitless balance. I paused, letting the heavy suspense build, watching Trent swallow hard as his throat bobbed. The bartender ran the titanium card, I stated clearly. Declined. Stop talking, Trent ordered. His voice lacked its previous booming authority. It sounded thin, reedy, and desperately panicked. It was a security freeze. I was traveling internationally last week. The fraud department flagged the out-of-state transaction. I ignored his pathetic excuse, keeping my eyes locked on Chloe. I watched as her face slowly lost its color, her eyes darting nervously between me and her fiancé as the ugly truth began to dawn on her. The bartender ran it a third time, Chloe, I said, emphasizing the number. 3 times. And then the bartender handed the heavy titanium card back and said, I am so sorry, sir, but the terminal says this account has been completely suspended for extreme delinquency. Please provide another valid form of payment immediately, or I will have to call the general manager. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the marble table, staring directly into Trent's panicked eyes. Tell me, Trent, did you ever manage to successfully open that tab? Or are we sitting in this luxurious room, drinking complimentary tap water, because you literally could not afford to order us a round of basic appetizers? The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. You could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of the air conditioning vent above us. The 3 lawyers shifted uncomfortably on their feet, exchanging nervous, knowing glances. They were hired to execute a ruthless legal shakedown, but even they recognized the distinct, unmistakable stench of a completely broke client who could not pay their retainer. Trent's face turned a violent, explosive shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff white collar. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at my face, dropping all pretense of aristocratic grace and refined manners. You are a liar, he roared, his voice cracking with unhinged fury. You are a bitter, jealous, pathetic liar trying to ruin us. Check his wallet, Chloe, I said calmly, leaning back again. Ask him to pull out the titanium Amex ending in 4108 and call the customer service number on the back right now. Put it on speakerphone for the whole room. Let us hear exactly what the automated system says about his limitless generational wealth. Chloe looked at Trent, her eyes wide with a sudden creeping terror. The perfect illusion was fracturing right before her eyes. Trent, she whispered, her voice trembling. Trent, just show her. Show her the banking app on your phone and shut her up. Prove her wrong. Trent did not reach for his phone. He did not reach for his wallet. Instead, he slammed both fists down on the marble table, shaking the crystal water glasses so hard they chimed against each other. I do not have to prove a damn thing to this ghetto trash, he screamed, his face contorted in an ugly, vicious sneer, completely abandoning his sophisticated persona. He spun around, pointing wildly at the door. That is it. I am entirely done playing nice with your family, Chloe. I am getting the general manager. I am having the security team drag this lying, delusional piece of garbage out of the restaurant right now. The moment Trent turned toward the door to flee the confrontation, my parents erupted. But in a horrifying display of misplaced loyalty, they did not attack Trent for his blatant racism, his obvious lies, or his disrespect toward their own blood. They turned their blind, desperate rage entirely on me, rushing to shield the crumbling facade of their future son-in-law. "Look what you did!" my mother shrieked, practically hyperventilating as she jumped up from her chair. She pointed a manicured finger at me as if I had committed a violent crime. "You are ruining your sister's future. You are ruining our family's reputation." My father slammed his hand against the wall, his face twisted with a terrifying toxic anger. "You have always been a jealous, spiteful little girl. Maya Trent is giving Chloe the world, and you are trying to destroy it out of pure spite, because you have absolutely nothing. You are going to apologize to him right this second, and you are going to sign that paper, or I will make sure you never step foot in our lives again." The VIP room descended into absolute deafening chaos as their shouts bounced off the walls, a desperate, frantic chorus trying to drown out the reality I had just exposed. The first thing that cut through the stunned silence was a sound. Click, clack. Sharp, rhythmic, and utterly unhurried. A woman stepped over the threshold. If this moment were being captured on film, the camera would be positioned low to the ground, tracking the confident, predatory stride of a woman stepping into the room. The lens would focus first on the unmistakable flash of crimson, the iconic red soles of 5-inch Christian Louboutin stilettos striking the polished hardwood floor. The heels hit the ground like a gavel demanding order. Slowly, the imaginary camera would pan up. It would take in the razor-sharp tailoring of a charcoal gray pinstripe suit cut with devastating precision. The structured shoulders and perfectly tapered waist screamed bespoke luxury and undeniable authority. Beneath the jacket, a crisp white silk blouse was unbuttoned, just enough to look effortless, yet formal enough to command a boardroom. Finally, the tracking shot would rise to reveal her face. High aristocratic cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and piercing emerald green eyes that swept across the room with the cool, calculating detachment of an apex predator assessing a cage full of very small, very loud mice. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless chignon, leaving no room for softness. She radiated a suffocating aura of power that instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the VIP dining room. Trent, still visibly flustered and breathing heavily from stumbling backward, latched onto her arrival like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. His face was still a mottled, angry red from his exposed financial humiliation. Looking at this newcomer, a white woman radiating wealth and authority, Trent's deeply ingrained prejudices immediately kicked in. He jumped to the most convenient conclusion his privileged, arrogant brain could muster. He assumed she was the management coming to save him from us. "Finally!" Trent barked, snapping his fingers in her direction with staggering disrespect. He puffed out his chest, attempting to reassert his shattered alpha male status. He pointed a trembling, furious finger back at me. "Are you the general manager of this establishment because your security team is entirely incompetent? I demand you remove this woman from the premises immediately. She is trespassing, she is harassing my family, and she is causing a massive disturbance. If you do not have her dragged out of here in the next 30 seconds, I will personally call the owners and ensure that this restaurant loses its liquor license by tomorrow morning." The woman did not blink. She did not flinch at his shouting. She didn't even acknowledge his existence. She treated Trent the same way one might treat a smear of dirt on a baseboard, something mildly unpleasant but entirely beneath her direct attention. Her emerald eyes bypassed the sputtering, red-faced man completely. Her gaze slid over my gaping parents and my furious sister before finally landing on me. For a fraction of a second, the icy, predatory edge in her eyes melted away, replaced by a soft, knowing warmth meant only for me. Then the ice returned. I remained perfectly relaxed in my leather dining chair, luxuriating in the beautiful disaster unfolding around me. I took another slow, agonizingly deliberate sip from my crystal glass of water, letting the cold liquid soothe my throat. "Trent," I said, my voice cutting through his ongoing tantrums, smooth and dripping with genuine amusement. "You really need to stop barking orders. You are embarrassing yourself even more, and frankly, it is getting exhausting to watch. Everyone, I would like to introduce you to Harper." I gestured gracefully toward the doorway. She is not the restaurant manager, she is my wife. And more importantly, for the three gentlemen cowering in the back of the room, she is my chief legal officer. The word wife hit the marble table like a live hand grenade. For a brief, suspended moment, the sheer shock of the announcement paralyzed my family. They had spent a decade treating me like the black sheep for dropping out of school to build my business, and now I was dropping a deeply personal revelation on them. But predictability is a hallmark of toxic people. The deeply ingrained bigotry and obsession with social optics quickly overrode their shock, blinding them entirely to the second, far more dangerous half of my introduction. My mother, Vivian, let out a dramatic, high-pitched gasp. Her hand flew to her chest, clutching her signature pearl so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "A wife!" she shrieked, her voice vibrating with horror and shame. "This is your grand secret. This is what you have been doing all these years, playing house with a woman." She looked frantically around the room as if seeking validation for her outrage from the walls themselves. "I knew it. I always knew there was something fundamentally broken about you, Maya. You could never just be normal and make us proud. You always had to be a deviant, always desperate for some sick kind of attention to ruin this family's good name." She took a step forward, her eyes blazing with a familiar, resentful fire. "You are selfish," my mother spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You are just as selfish as the night you packed your bags and walked out onto the street because I refused to pay for your garbage app idea. I had to save that money to buy a Mercedes for Chloe's graduation. You expect me to fund your delusions while your sister was actually achieving something real. And now you bring this woman here to humiliate us." My father Marcus scoffed loudly, crossing his arms and shaking his head in profound, toxic disappointment. "It makes perfect sense now," he muttered, his voice laced with disdain. "No respectable man would ever put up with your rebellious, stubborn attitude. So you went and found yourself a little girlfriend to play startup with. You think this makes you special? You think bringing your lesbian lover to your sister's wedding negotiation gives you some kind of leverage? I am telling you right now, Maya, you sign that paper or I am disowning you. Again. And this time it is permanent. You are an absolute embarrassment to the Williams name." Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. "Oh, Maya, this is just sad. You were so jealous that I am marrying into the Blackwood family that you had to go and stage this little stunt. You actually brought your fake spouse to try and intimidate us. Trent is offering me a real marriage, a real legacy. And you show up with her, you are just a bitter, lonely dropout who cannot stand to see me win." They were so caught up in their homophobic outrage, so gleefully distracted by what they perceived as my moral failing, that they were completely oblivious to the catastrophic shift happening right behind them. While my parents and sister were busy hurling insults, and Trent was busy trying to pull his shattered ego back together, the three corporate lawyers standing against the back wall were undergoing a terrifying metamorphosis. When they had first entered the room, they had been the picture of slick, predatory confidence. They had stood behind my family like silent enforcers, clutching their thick leather briefcases, ready to bully and threaten a small business owner into signing away her life's work. But the moment the words "chief legal officer" left my mouth and the moment they actually looked at Harper's face, their arrogant smirks vanished entirely. These men operated in the corporate legal sphere. They knew exactly who Harper was. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was a legend known for orchestrating bloodbaths in boardrooms, dismantling Fortune 500 companies, and destroying careers without breaking a sweat. The lead lawyer, the one in the gray suit who had confidently threatened to bankrupt me with frivolous litigation just 10 minutes ago, was staring at Harper as if he had just seen the Grim Reaper herself. All the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale ashen hue. A heavy bead of sweat broke out on his forehead, tracking slowly down his temple. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silence. The second lawyer, a younger man with slicked back hair, took a sharp, shaky step backward. His eyes were wide and frantic, darting around the room, as if desperately searching for a fire exit. He bumped heavily into the mahogany wainscoting, his breathing shallow and rapid. But it was the third lawyer whose reaction was the most spectacular display of utter defeat. He was staring directly at Harper's razor-sharp charcoal suit. His hands began to tremble. It started as a slight tremor, but within seconds he was shaking so violently that he lost his grip entirely. The thick, heavy manila folder he had been clutching against his chest slipped from his sweaty fingers. The folder hit the polished hardwood floor with a loud, echoing smack that sounded like a gunshot in the tense room. Stacks of printed case files, fake legal precedents, and blank injunction forms spilled out, scattering across the floor in a messy, chaotic pile. He didn't even bend down to pick them up. He just stood there, paralyzed, his trembling hands hovering in the air, staring at Harper in absolute, unadulterated terror. My family, interrupted by the sudden noise of the dropping folder, finally paused their barrage of insults. They looked back at the lawyers, deeply confused by their sudden, pathetic display of panic. Trent frowned, looking from the sweating lead attorney to Harper, a flicker of genuine apprehension finally piercing through his arrogant density. Harper didn't spare my family a single glance. She didn't react to my mother's slurs or my father's threats. She simply walked forward. The click-clack of her Louboutins was the only sound in the room, parting the space like Moses splitting the sea. Trent instinctively stepped out of her way, shrinking back as she passed him. She reached the edge of the cold marble table. With a slow, deliberate grace, she unbuttoned the single button of her suit jacket. She slid her sleek black leather briefcase from under her arm and tossed it casually onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud right next to the silver Mont Blanc pen I had driven through Chloe's extortion contract. Harper placed both of her hands flat on the smooth marble, leaning forward slightly. Her emerald eyes locked onto the three terrified lawyers huddled against the back wall. A slow, chilling smile spread across her lips, a smile that held zero warmth and promised absolute destruction. "Are you boys really using your law licenses to extort my wife?" The lead attorney, the man who had so confidently threatened to bury my business in frivolous litigation just 20 minutes prior, swallowed so loudly it sounded like a stone dropping in a quiet well. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords completely failed him. Harper did not wait for a response. She reached out with one perfectly manicured hand, her emerald-cut wedding ring catching the ambient light of the crystal chandelier, and gripped the silver Mont Blanc pen I had driven into the marble table. With a sharp, effortless yank, she dislodged the metal tip. She picked up the thick stack of paper with the ragged hole punched straight through its center and began flipping through the pages. The sound of rustling paper was incredibly loud, slicing through the heavy, terrified silence of the VIP room. If a camera were pushing in on Harper's face right now, it would capture the lethal, predatory focus in her eyes as she scanned the dense legal jargon. She was not just reading. She was mentally dismantling their entire corporate strategy line by line. Quick cuts would show the rapid deterioration of the three men in gray suits. The lead lawyer raised a trembling hand to wipe a heavy layer of sweat from his brow. The second lawyer aggressively tugged at his silk tie as if the fabric were suddenly suffocating him. The third lawyer, still staring at the dropped files scattered across the floor, began breathing in short, shallow, panicked gasps. "This document is absolutely fascinating," Harper said, her voice dropping to a smooth conversational purr that was infinitely more terrifying than Trent's unhinged screaming. She let the pages fall back onto the marble surface with a dismissive slap. "You drafted an authorization of asset transfer, a document specifically designed to force my wife to leverage her intellectual property and liquid assets to secure an $80,000 credit line for a third party." The lead lawyer finally managed to scrape together a miserable shred of his corporate bravado. "Now listen here, Ms. Sterling," he stammered, his voice lacking any of its previous booming bass. "This is a standard familial collateral agreement. Ms. Williams's parents formally requested we draft a mediation contract to resolve an internal financial dispute." Harper's eyes snapped up, locking onto him with terrifying precision. The imaginary camera pushes in close on her face, filling the frame with her absolute icy authority. "A mediation contract?" Harper repeated softly. She leaned forward, resting her knuckles on the table. "Section 4, Paragraph 2 explicitly states that if Maya Williams refuses to sign, Your firm will immediately file a comprehensive multi-count lawsuit against her software company. You threaten to petition for emergency injunctions, freeze her business operating accounts, and bury her in litigation fees until she is entirely bankrupt. She tilted her head, her gaze pinning the sweating man to the wall like a biological specimen. Tell me, counselor, does the State Bar of Georgia currently classify blackmail as standard familial mediation? The lawyer flinched as if he had been physically struck across the jaw. Because according to the penal code, Harper continued, her voice gaining a sharp metallic edge that demanded absolute submission, threatening malicious, baseless civil litigation with the express intent of forcing an individual to surrender financial assets, is not a legal negotiation. It is criminal extortion. It is coercion under duress. It is a felony. A quick cut to Trent. His arrogant face was twisted in profound, desperate confusion. He looked from Harper to his highly paid legal team, waiting for them to unleash their corporate fury. He expected them to bark back to drown this woman in aggressive legal threats to assert his dominance in the room. "Do something!" Trent barked, slapping his palm against the table. "Why are you just standing there letting her talk to you like this? I pay your firm a massive retainer to handle situations exactly like this. Put this woman in her place." The lawyers did not move. They did not even look at Trent. Their eyes remained completely paralyzed by the woman standing across the table, their survival instincts overriding any loyalty to their client. Harper slowly turned her head toward Trent. The camera would push in on her perfectly arched eyebrow. "You do not pay these men a retainer, Trent. Your father's trust fund does. And I highly doubt your father's board of directors authorized his legal team to act as high-priced thugs for a penniless groom desperately trying to fund a wedding cake because his own credit cards are bouncing at the bar." Trent opened his mouth to scream another insult, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple, but Harper simply raised one single finger. The gesture was so quiet, so effortlessly commanding, that Trent actually clamped his mouth shut, his jaw clicking audibly. Harper returned her attention to the three sweating men in gray suits. She unclasped the brushed steel lock of her black leather briefcase. It opened with a sharp, heavy snap. She reached inside and pulled out 3 separate manila folders. With a quick, practiced flick of her wrist, she tossed the folders onto the marble table. They slid across the smooth surface, stopping precisely in front of the 3 attorneys. "What are these?" the lead lawyer whispered, staring down at the folders as if they contained live explosives. "Open them and find out," Harper commanded. The youngest lawyer, the one whose hands were still shaking violently, reached out and flipped open the top folder. The camera would cut to an extreme close-up of the crisp white document inside. At the very top, printed in bold, uncompromising black letters, was the official seal of the State Bar Association. Below the seal read the heading, "Formal Grievance and Petition for Immediate Disbarment." The young lawyer let out a pathetic, strangled whimper. He looked at Harper, his eyes wide with genuine career-ending panic. "As you can clearly see," Harper said, her voice ringing with the clarity of a judge handing down a terminal sentence, "I have already taken the liberty of drafting formal complaints to the disciplinary committee for each of you. I have cited your explicit threats of malicious prosecution, your documented attempt to execute a fraudulent contract under severe duress, and your willing participation in criminal extortion. I have also attached a lovely detailed affidavit outlining exactly how you knowingly tried to weaponize the legal system against a thriving technology company on behalf of a client who currently cannot even afford to buy his future in laws a bottle of sparkling water." The lead lawyer wiped his face with a trembling hand, smearing sweat across his forehead. "You cannot prove intent," he whispered, though his voice was entirely stripped of conviction. "You cannot prove we knew the lawsuit was completely frivolous." Harper smiled. The camera pushes in incredibly tight on her face. It was a terrifying, beautiful smile that promised absolute ruin. "I am the chief legal officer of a technology conglomerate currently valued at over $200 million, Harper said softly, her words landing like physical blows to their chests. "My legal department employs 45 of the most ruthless, brilliant litigators in this country. I have a virtually unlimited budget, and an absolute lack of mercy when it comes to people who threaten my wife. Do you truly want to test what I can prove? Do you really want to spend the next 5 years of your lives and every single dime of your personal savings fighting my firm in a disciplinary tribunal? She leaned closer, her green eyes flashing. I will not just take your law licenses. I will take your homes. I will empty your retirement accounts. I will ensure that the only job you are legally qualified to perform in this state is scraping gum off the sidewalk outside my office building. Quick cuts would capture the sheer devastation spreading across the rest of the room. My mother, Vivian, had completely stopped breathing. Her hand was frozen on her pearls, her mouth slightly ajar as she finally realized the staggering magnitude of the wealth and power sitting across from her. My father, Marcus, looked pale and hollowed out, his previous threats of disownment hanging awkwardly in the air, instantly rendered pathetic and entirely meaningless. Chloe looked back and forth between the terrifying woman in the tailored suit and her sweating, silent fiancé, the grand illusion of her elite future violently shattering around her. Harper leaned back, buttoning her suit jacket with the same elegant precision she had used to unbutton it. You have exactly 30 seconds to pick up your garbage from the floor, leave this restaurant, and never contact my wife or her business ever again. If you are not entirely out of my sight by the time I check my watch, I am pressing send on those emails to the state bar. For a span of 3 agonizing seconds, absolutely nobody moved. The air in the VIP room was thick, suffocating, entirely dominated by the sheer gravitational force of Harper's ultimatum. Then the lead lawyer broke. He did not say a single word to Trent. He did not attempt to negotiate or save face. He simply dropped the forged contract onto the table, grabbed the state bar complaint with a shaking hand, and practically dove for the heavy oak door. The other 2 lawyers scrambled wildly to follow him. The youngest one dropped to his knees, frantically clawing at the scattered papers on the floor, shoving them haphazardly into his briefcase without bothering to organize them. He bumped his shoulder hard against the doorframe in his blind desperation to escape the room, his polished corporate image completely destroyed. "Wait!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking, finally snapping out of his paralyzed state. "Where are you going? You work for my family. I command you to stay here and handle this. You are my lawyers. Do your damn jobs." The lead lawyer paused in the doorway, just long enough to look over his shoulder. The fear in his eyes had been completely replaced by furious, burning resentment. "We work for your father's trust, Trent," he hissed, his corporate mask entirely gone. "And I am not losing my license and my livelihood because you decided to play big shot with money you do not even have access to. You are on your own." Without another word, the 3 men in gray suits bolted down the carpeted hallway of the restaurant, their footsteps echoing rapidly as they sprinted toward the exit. Trent lunged toward the doorway, grabbing the heavy brass handle. "Come back here!" he shrieked, his voice echoing pathetically down the corridor. "I will have you all fired. I will ruin you." But he was screaming at an empty hallway. The great, powerful legal team he had brought to crush me had completely abandoned him. They had fled in absolute terror, leaving Trent standing in the doorway, entirely exposed and utterly powerless. The heavy oak door slowly swung shut on its hydraulic hinges, closing with a soft, definitive click that sealed the remaining 6 of us inside the room. The frantic, echoing footsteps of the retreating legal team faded into the carpeted corridors of the restaurant, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy enough to crush bone. The visual divide in the VIP room was stark and absolute. On one side of the vast marble table sat Harper, and I, perfectly still, radiating an aura of untouchable calm. On the opposite side stood Trent, my sister Chloe, and my parents, resembling the survivors of a sudden violent shipwreck. They were a portrait of aristocratic panic and shattered delusions. Trent stood near the doorway for a long moment, staring at the polished wood panels, as if he could magically will his high-priced corporate muscle back into existence. His chest heaved with ragged, uneven breaths. The realization that he had been completely abandoned by the very men he had hired to intimidate me was visibly short-circuiting his privileged brain. But narcissism is a powerful, blinding force. Instead of recognizing his defeat, Trent allowed his bruised ego to violently hijack his survival instincts. He turned back to face the room. He ran a trembling hand through his perfectly styled blonde hair, desperately trying to smooth it back into place. He aggressively yanked down the lapels of his suit jacket, forcing his shoulders backward to rebuild his towering, imposing posture. The arrogant sneer slowly crawled back onto his face, though it looked brittle now, like a cracked porcelain mask ready to shatter at the slightest touch. "You actually think this changes anything?" Trent sneered, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register as he slowly stalked back toward the table. "You think terrifying 3 spineless junior partners with empty threats means you have won. You think you have somehow outsmarted me." He planted his hands on the back of his chair, leaning forward to glare at Harper and me. He was completely ignoring the reality of the situation, choosing instead to wrap himself in the comfortable, protective blanket of his family name. "You have absolutely no idea who you are messing with." Trent growled, his voice vibrating with a toxic, unearned superiority. "The Blackwood name is an institution in this state. We do not just have money, we have power. We have generational influence that you and your pathetic, newly wealthy little wife could not possibly comprehend." My parents, desperately clinging to the fading illusion of proximity to elite whiteness, immediately fell back into line behind him. My mother stepped forward, her face twisted with a mixture of fear and furious resentment, directed entirely at me. "Maya, you have gone entirely too far," my mother cried out, wringing her hands together. "You need to stop this madness right now, before you do irreparable damage. Trent is a forgiving man, but you are pushing him. You are going to ruin Chloe's life." My father pointed a stern finger at me, his voice booming with misplaced patriarchal authority. "You listen to me, Maya. You are going to call those lawyers back. You are going to apologize to this man, and you are going to write that check. You are not going to humiliate us in front of the Blackwood family." Chloe, emboldened by our parents' blind loyalty and Trent's renewed aggression, crossed her arms over her chest and glared at me with absolute contempt. "You are making the biggest mistake of your life, Maya. You think your little tech company makes you untouchable. You are nothing compared to Trent." Trent fed off their sycophantic energy. He stood taller, a cruel, vicious smile spreading across his face. He looked directly at me, his blue eyes flashing with a promise of total destruction. "Listen to your family, Maya," Trent warned, his tone dripping with condescension. "Because if you do not walk out of here and wire that $80,000 to my accounts by tomorrow morning, I will make it my personal mission to destroy you. My father's wealth management firm controls billions of dollars in assets. We have members of the Senate on our speed dial. We sit on the boards of the very banks that hold your corporate accounts." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "I will have my father make one single phone call. Just one. And his firm will absolutely crush your little business. We will buy out your vendors. We will freeze your supply chains. We will legally bleed your company dry until you are bankrupt, ruined, and begging on the streets for a fraction of what I graciously asked you for today. You will lose everything." The room held its breath. My parents looked terrified by the threat, completely believing every single word pouring out of his mouth. Chloe looked victorious, a smug smile resting on her lips as she waited for me to finally break, to finally bow my head and submit to the superior power of the Blackwood dynasty. I looked at Trent. I looked at his puffed-out chest, his arrogant smirk, and the absolute unwavering certainty in his eyes that he was the untouchable predator in this room. And then I laughed. It did not start as a polite chuckle. It was a loud, full-throated, ringing laugh that burst out of my chest and echoed violently against the mahogany walls. I threw my head back, genuinely delighted by the sheer magnificent absurdity of his threats. I laughed until my sides ached, wiping a tear of pure amusement from the corner of my eye. Trent's smug smile instantly vanished, his face contorted with confusion and fresh boiling rage. "What the hell is so funny?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. I took a deep breath, waving my hand dismissively in the air to calm myself down. I looked over at Harper, who was sitting perfectly still, watching Trent with the cold, detached fascination of a scientist observing a particularly stupid insect walking directly into a trap. "I am sorry," I gasped, pressing a hand to my chest. I really am. It is just that the sheer confidence with which you lie is truly breathtaking. It belongs in a museum. I turned my head slightly. Harper, darling, I said, my voice smooth and light. Would you please do the honors? I do not think Trent fully understands the current state of his own family's financial empire. Harper did not say a word. She simply reached into her sleek leather briefcase for the second time. Her movements were agonizingly slow, deliberately drawing out the suspense, forcing Trent to watch her every move. Her manicured fingers bypassed the thick stacks of white legal documents and emerged holding a single vibrant red folder. The color was striking against the muted tones of the room. She placed the red folder gently onto the marble table right between us. Trent stared at the folder, his eyes narrowing. "What is that?" he demanded, though the bravado in his voice was rapidly bleeding away, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. More fake legal threats. Harper let out a soft, melodic hum of amusement. She rested her elbows on the table and steepled her fingers together, her emerald eyes locking onto Trent with laser precision. "You speak very highly of your father's wealth management firm, Trent Harper," began, her voice crisp and echoing with absolute authority. "You brag about the billions of dollars in assets under management. You boast about your ability to crush my wife's business with a single phone call. It is a very impressive narrative. It relies heavily on the assumption that your family actually has any money left." My mother frowned, stepping closer to the table. "What on earth is she talking about, Trent?" Trent swallowed hard, a visible bead of sweat tracking down the side of his face. "She is lying," he snapped, though he did not take his eyes off the red folder. "She is just trying to spin another lie to get out of paying the mediation fee." Harper's lips curled into a razor-thin smile. She reached out and flipped the red folder open. She extracted a thick, heavily redacted document printed on thick, ivory paper. She slid it across the smooth marble surface. It stopped exactly 3 inches from Trent's fingertips. "I strongly suggest you read the executive summary," Trent Harper said, her tone suddenly dropping 10 degrees, turning sharp and lethal. "It is an internal financial report from the Securities and Exchange Commission, cross-referenced with forensic accounting data my firm compiled over the last 48 hours. Trent stared down at the document. He did not touch it. His hands remained frozen on the back of his chair. "We are not here to discuss your father's corporate failure," Trent Harper continued, tapping a manicured nail against the ivory paper. "We are here to discuss yours. Because while your father's fund officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the Southern District Court of New York exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes ago, this folder contains a much more urgent problem for you." Harper withdrew a fresh stack of papers. These were not printed on corporate letterhead. They were harsh, glaring copies of personal bank statements, offshore wire transfer logs, and screenshots of encrypted text messages. She spread them out across the marble table like a dealer revealing a winning hand at a casino. The word casino was entirely appropriate. $80,000, Harper stated, her voice slicing cleanly through the chilled air of the VIP room. "It is a very specific, oddly precise number for a wedding cake, and some floral arrangements, do you not think? Especially when the wedding planner for this supposedly lavish affair has not received a single deposit." Chloe jerked in her seat. She tore her gaze away from Trent and stared at Harper. "What are you talking about? Trent wired the deposit to the planner 2 weeks ago." "Did he?" I asked, leaning forward and resting my chin on my hands. "Look at the papers, Chloe." Harper tapped her finger against the top document. "This is a comprehensive forensic trace of Trent's personal accounts over the last 6 months. There was no wire transfer to a wedding planner. There was, however, a massive hemorrhaging of funds to offshore betting accounts, high-stakes poker rooms, and most recently, a string of desperate, panicked messages to a notoriously violent underground loan syndicate operating out of Miami." The color drained from Chloe's face so fast she looked physically ill. I watched the realization hit her, my focus racking perfectly between my sister's trembling, horrified expression and Trent's sickly, sweating panic. He looked exactly like a cornered animal. "You see," Chloe Harper continued, her voice devoid of any pity, "your fiancé does not have a liquidity issue. He has a severe gambling addiction. He has completely liquidated his trust fund, maxed out every line of credit in his name, and quietly taken out loans against assets he does not even own. He owes exactly $80,000 to people who do not send corporate lawyers to collect their debts. They send men who break legs. Harper leaned back, folding her hands quietly together. He did not bring his lawyers here today to negotiate a wedding budget. He brought them here to extort his future sister-in-law, because his kneecaps have a rapidly approaching expiration date. You are not marrying a billionaire, Chloe. You are marrying a Mark. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. I watched the dynamic of the room shift focus again. Chloe slowly stood up from her chair. Her designer dress looked suddenly ill-fitting, her perfect posture completely crumbling. She turned to look at the man she had been parading around as her golden ticket to high society. Trent could not even meet her eyes. He was staring at the floor, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Trent," Chloe whispered. Her voice was fragile, completely stripped of its usual haughty arrogance. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me this is some kind of sick joke Maya set up to ruin my day. Please." Trent opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an exit, an excuse, a scapegoat. He found nothing. "Baby," he finally choked out, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Baby, listen to me. It got a little out of hand. Okay? The market was volatile. I took some risks to secure our future. I just needed a bridge loan, just a quick influx of cash to cover the margin calls. I was going to pay it back. I just needed your sister to do her part for the family." "Do her part," Chloe repeated, her voice rising in pitch, teetering on the edge of genuine hysteria. "You used our wedding. You used my name to shake down my sister to pay off your bookie. It is 80 grand! Trent suddenly shouted, the cornered rat finally snapping. "It is nothing. If she just signed the paper, nobody would have been hurt. We would have gotten married, the debt would be clear, and we could have moved on. But your selfish, stubborn sister had to bring her corporate attack dog to ruin everything." Chloe took a massive step back from him as if he were radioactive. The illusion was entirely dead. The man standing before her was not a titan of industry. He was a desperate, broke, manipulative fraud who had been willing to throw her family into financial ruin just to save his own skin. But the most disturbing reaction in the room did not come from Chloe. It came from my parents. Faced with the undeniable documented proof that the man they had been worshipping was a broke, gambling-addicted con artist, a normal parent would have thrown him out. A normal parent would have shielded their daughters and called the police. But Vivian and Marcus Williams were not normal parents. They were addicts themselves, entirely addicted to social status optics and the intoxicating proximity to old money. Confronted with the absolute destruction of their social climbing dreams, their minds simply rejected reality. They experienced a violent, desperate cognitive dissonance. If Trent was a fraud, then their entire worldview was a joke, and they would rather defend a predator than admit they were wrong. "Now let us all just take a deep breath," my mother suddenly announced, her voice unnaturally bright and shrill. She stepped between Chloe and Trent, physically shielding the man who had just admitted to extorting us. "Every great family faces financial hiccups. The Blackwoods are an institution. Markets fluctuate. This is just a temporary setback." Harper let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "Mrs. Williams, he is into loan sharks for $80,000. He is going to be indicted for fraud." "You stay out of this!" my father roared, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with my mother. His face was a mask of furious, unyielding pride. He glared at me, his eyes burning with a toxic, hateful fire. "You did this, Maya. You came in here with your parlor tricks and your stolen documents just to embarrass your sister." "Dad, he lied to us," Chloe cried out, her voice breaking. "He is broke." "Quiet." Chloe Marcus snapped, shutting her down instantly. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his suit jacket with a jerky, rigid motion. He looked at Trent, then looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He was doubling down. He was choosing the illusion of the Blackwood name over the safety of his own daughters. "Even so, this family is still a high-class family in Buckhead. We'll pay for the wedding ourselves. We don't need your penniless money." The echo of my father's desperate, booming declaration bounced off the crystal chandelier above us, fading into a pathetic, suffocating silence. He stood there, chest heaving, his face flushed with a toxic cocktail of wounded pride and blind arrogance. He was clinging to the rotting wreckage of our family's social standing, genuinely believing that shouting louder would somehow rewrite reality. He believed that the sheer force of his patriarchal authority could summon wealth out of thin air to cover a massive, humiliating deficit. I did not flinch. I did not shrink back into my chair the way I had for the first 20 years of my life. If a camera were filming this exact moment, it would be mounted on a Steadicam, executing a slow, continuous orbit around my chair. As the lens circled me, the ambient lighting of the VIP room would seem to subtly shift the background, plunging into shadows, while a sharp, commanding light focused entirely on my face. The terrified, sweating figures of my parents, my sister, and her fraudulent fiancé would blur into the periphery. This was the exact second the scapegoat died and the Titan was born. I was officially stepping into the role they never believed I could play. "You will pay for it yourselves," I repeated, my voice stripping away the last remaining shreds of familial warmth. The words came out smooth, deadly, and perfectly level. "With what money, Marcus?" My father blinked, momentarily derailed by my use of his first name. "We have assets," he sputtered, his hands gripping the edge of the marble table as if it were a life raft. "We have the house in Buckhead, we have our portfolios, we are not some common working-class family that begs for handouts. We have liquidity." "You have a second mortgage with an adjustable rate that is currently drowning you," I countered, not raising my voice a single decibel. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, locking eyes with the man who had spent a lifetime making me feel infinitely small. "You have a country club membership that is 3 months in arrears. You have leased luxury vehicles, credit cards maxed out to maintain the illusion of generational wealth, and a retirement account you have been quietly depleting to pay for Chloe's designer wardrobe so she could catch a man exactly like Trent. You do not have $80,000 in liquid cash to throw at a wedding, Dad. You do not even have $80,000 to save your own life." My mother, Vivian, let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. "Maya, how dare you speak to your father that way? How dare you sit there and invent these vicious lies about our finances?" "Because they are not lies, Vivian, and you know it," I stated, shifting my gaze to her. She instinctively recoiled, her hand flying up to clutch her signature string of pearls. "You have spent the last 7 years treating me like a contagious disease. You told your friends I was a disappointment. You told your country club circle that I was throwing my life away playing with computers in a basement. You called my business a cute little hobby. You called it a pathetic excuse for a career." I tilted my head, studying their panicked, defensive faces. "Tell me something. In all those years of mocking me, in all those years of elevating Chloe to the status of a living goddess while treating me like dirt on your designer shoes, did either of you ever actually bother to type my name into a Google search bar? Did you ever even once try to find out what my little company actually does?" The question hung in the room, dripping with absolute lethal condescension. My parents exchanged a swift, terrified glance. They had not. Of course they had not. Their narcissism was so complete, their belief in my inherent failure so absolute, that they had never wasted a single calorie of energy investigating my life. Harper moved with the flawless, synchronized precision of a predator closing the trap. She did not say a word. She simply reached into the black leather briefcase for the third and final time. She pulled out a pristine, glossy magazine. With a sharp flick of her wrist, Harper tossed the magazine onto the center of the marble table. It slid across the polished surface with a slick, heavy whisper, coming to a dead stop, exactly equidistant between Trent, Chloe, and my parents. It was the newest unreleased issue of Forbes magazine, slated to hit national newsstands the following morning. The camera would focus rapidly, snapping from Trent's horrified eyes down to the glossy cover, then to Chloe's trembling lips and back to the cover again. Their printed in vibrant high-definition color was a full-page photograph of me. I was wearing a tailored black suit, standing with my arms crossed against a backdrop of a sleek glass-walled skyscraper in Silicon Valley. My expression in the photograph was exactly the same as the one I was wearing right now, cold, calculating, and entirely untouchable. Above my head, printed in massive bold yellow lettering, was the headline, "The Apex Predator of Debt. How Maya Williams Built Obsidian FinTech into a $2 billion unicorn." The air in the VIP room seemed to instantly evaporate. The collective intake of breath from the opposite side of the table sounded like a vacuum sealing. Two billion. Chloe whispered, her voice fracturing into a pathetic, airy squeak. She leaned over the table, staring at the glossy cover as if it were an alien artifact, her eyes tracing the zeros in the headline over and over again, her brain violently rejecting the mathematical reality. "That is impossible. That is a typo. You write software for accounting." "I am the chief executive officer and sole founder of Obsidian FinTech," I said, allowing the sheer crushing weight of the title to echo in the room. "We do not write accounting software, Chloe. We write proprietary artificial intelligence algorithms that analyze, package, and aggressively acquire distressed corporate and private debt. We are a financial technology unicorn. We hunt bad investments, we buy them for pennies on the dollar, and we liquidate them with absolute unforgiving efficiency." My company was independently valued last week by 3 separate Wall Street firms at exactly $2.4 billion. I watched the psychological destruction happen in real time. It was a masterpiece of devastation. My father's knees buckled slightly, forcing him to grip the back of Trent's chair to keep from collapsing onto the carpet. His face had drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, chalky gray. The man who had based his entire identity on his modest wealth management firm was suddenly faced with a daughter whose net worth eclipsed his entire client roster combined. His jaw hung slack, his eyes wide and glassy, completely short-circuited by the astronomical figure. My mother looked as if she were actively having a stroke. Her hands were shaking so violently that her pearls clattered audibly against her collarbone. She looked from the magazine cover to my face, then back to the magazine, her eyes darting in a frantic, desperate rhythm. This was the daughter she had hidden from her friends. This was the daughter she had deemed a social liability, a billionaire. She had alienated a billionaire just to secure a marriage to a broke, gambling-addicted fraud. The profound, sickening realization of her own colossal stupidity was physically breaking her down. Trent was entirely paralyzed. The arrogant, imposing frat boy who had threatened to destroy my company with a single phone call was now violently aware that he had brought a butter knife to a nuclear war. He was staring at Harper, finally understanding why her legal threats carried the terrifying weight of absolute certainty. He had tried to extort $80,000 from a woman who could buy his entire bloodline and sell it for scrap before lunch. My father stammered, his voice reduced to a dry, raspy wheeze. "You are worth $2 billion, Maya. Why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us treat you like garbage?" I offered helpfully, a cold smile playing on my lips. "Because I needed to know exactly who you were, Marcus. I needed to see exactly how far you would go to secure your proximity to the Blackwood name. And you did not disappoint. You willingly served me up to be slaughtered just to pay for Chloe's party." Chloe was shaking her head in denial, her perfect blowout falling into disarray as she backed away from the table. No, this isn't real. You are lying. You are just trying to ruin my wedding. You are just jealous of Trent. You always have been. Jealous of a man who leverages his fiancé's family to pay off loan sharks?" I asked, my voice dripping with pure ice. I stood up from my chair. The movement was slow, deliberate, and commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. I smoothed the front of my tailored jacket, looking down at the 4 shattered figures cowering on the other side of the marble table. The $2 billion valuation is a staggering number. "I admit," I said softly, letting the silence stretch out, drawing the tension tight until it felt like a piano wire ready to snap. "It is enough money to rewrite reality. It is enough money to make people like you lose their minds." I leaned forward, placing both of my hands flat on the marble surface, leaning over the glossy Forbes magazine featuring my face. I locked eyes with Trent, whose pupils were dilated in sheer, unadulterated terror. "But you want to know the real secret, Trent?" I whispered, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. You think the valuation is the surprise? You think my net worth is the reason I brought you all here today? I smiled, and it was the most terrifying, ruthless expression I had ever worn in my life. That is not the biggest shock, I promised, my voice dropping to a lethal purr. The $2 billion is just the prelude. Harper did not even look at Trent when she reached into the black leather briefcase one final time. She withdrew a single sheet of heavy watermarked paper. She did not slide this document across the marble table like she had done with the others. Instead, she stood up the sharp click of her heels, breaking the suffocating silence of the VIP room, and walked deliberately around the table. She stopped directly beside my mother and handed the document to her. If a camera were capturing this exact moment, it would push into an extreme close-up of my mother's hand. The frame would be entirely filled by Vivian's perfectly manicured fingers, weighed down by a 5-carat diamond ring grasping the crisp white paper. The visual would highlight the violent, uncontrollable trembling of her hand. The paper rattled audibly, a dry, frantic sound that echoed the total collapse of her carefully constructed reality. The tremor traveled up her wrist, shaking the gold bracelets on her arm, as her eyes locked onto the bold black letters printed at the top of the page. You boldly claimed you would pay for this lavish wedding yourself, Marcus. I said, my voice smooth, clinical, and echoing off the mahogany walls. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The quiet authority in my tone commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. You shouted that you do not need my money. You paraded your status, demanding respect because you consider yourselves the absolute pinnacle of Black excellence in Atlanta. You wanted everyone in this room and everyone in your elite social circles to believe you were untouchable, completely independent, and vastly wealthy. I slowly stood up from my chair, mirroring Harper's commanding posture. I looked down at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel infinitely small. But the truth is much darker, and frankly, much more pathetic. I continued pacing slowly behind my chair. You have spent the last decade building a magnificent castle, Marcus. You hosted charity galas, you maintained your platinum status at the country club, and you bought Chloe a new designer wardrobe every single season. You crafted a flawless public image of generational wealth, but you built that entire castle out of sand. And the tide has finally come in. My father opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The booming patriarchal authority he had weaponized just minutes ago had vanished entirely. He looked physically diminished, his broad shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of exposure. While you were busy telling your country club friends that I was a massive disappointment because I lived in a small apartment and worked 18-hour days, I said, my gaze sweeping over my parents, you were secretly signing away the very walls of your own home. You mortgaged the Buckhead estate, Vivian, and you did not just do it once. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. Her eyes squeezed tightly shut, as if she could block out the sound of my voice. She could not. You took out the first secret mortgage 5 years ago, I stated, reciting the data with flawless precision. That was right around the time Chloe demanded a luxury graduation trip through Europe and a brand new car. You did not have the cash, so you borrowed against the equity of your home to keep up appearances. You took out the second mortgage 2 years later to fund the down payment on Chloe's high-rise condo, because heaven forbid your golden child live in a regular apartment like her failure of a sister. I stopped pacing and leaned my hands flat on the marble table, staring directly into my father's wide, terrified eyes. But the third mortgage was the most desperate of them all. I whispered, my voice slicing through the chilled air. You finalized the third mortgage exactly 8 months ago, right around the time Chloe started dating Trent. You needed a massive influx of cash to keep up with the Blackwood family. You needed to host extravagant dinners, lease a newer Mercedes, and buy custom-tailored gowns just to prove to Trent's parents that you belonged at their table. You funded this entire aristocratic charade with borrowed money that you absolutely could not afford to pay back. I shifted my gaze to my sister. Chloe looked like she had been physically struck. Her perfect, smug composure was entirely gone. Her jaw hung slack, her eyes darting frantically between her sweating fiancé and her terrified parents. The profound, tragic irony of the situation was finally dawning on her. She had spent the last 8 months believing she had secured her future by trapping a billionaire heir, only to discover Trent was a broke, desperate gambling addict running from loan sharks. And Trent had proposed to Chloe believing he was marrying into immense, untouchable wealth, hoping to use her family's money to pay off his massive debts. They were two completely bankrupt frauds, violently colliding in a desperate attempt to scam each other. And when their mutual lack of funds threatened to expose them both, they had conspired to use me as the bank to finance their mutual delusion. "It is truly poetic," I said, a cold, humorless smile touching my lips. "Trent needs $80,000 to save his kneecaps from underground enforcers, and you, Marcus, need to maintain the illusion of wealth so desperately that you are willing to let him extort your own daughter to fund a wedding you cannot afford." "That is a lie," my father wheezed, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping across concrete. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "We have investments. We have portfolios. We just have a minor liquidity issue right now. The market has been difficult. We are not bankrupt. We are still the Williams family." I looked at the piece of paper trembling in my mother's hand. "According to the official legal document your wife is currently holding," I said, my tone dropping to a lethal, unforgiving register, "your primary lender strongly disagrees with your assessment. You do not have a minor liquidity issue, Marcus. You have systematically drained every single cent of equity out of the Buckhead property. You have maxed out your leverage." I watched the last spark of defiance extinguish in my father's eyes as I delivered the final fatal sequence of facts. "Your accounts have been officially categorized as toxic." I continued, my words landing like heavy rhythmic blows. "You are exactly 90 days past due on your consolidated mortgage payments. The grace period has expired. The bank has internally marked your debt as non-performing. They have initiated pre-foreclosure proceedings on the Buckhead estate. You do not have a home anymore, Marcus. You are living in a house owned by a bank that is currently drafting the eviction notices." The VIP room was plunged into a silence so profound it felt like the oxygen had been entirely sucked out of the air. Trent stared at the floor, completely defeated. Chloe was openly weeping now, the silent, heavy tears of a woman who had just watched her entire future burn to the ground. My father slumped down into his chair, covering his face with his trembling hands, the grand illusion of his black excellence facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. My mother, Vivian, slowly lowered the document. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her perfectly styled hair looking suddenly fragile and unkempt. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and profound, agonizing confusion. She could not comprehend how the daughter she had dismissed as a failure possessed this level of intimate, catastrophic information. "Maya." My mother choked out her voice, barely a ragged whisper. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself, her breath hitching in her throat. The document in her hand fluttered against the marble. Sao may li bieten hang dang dai no." "How could you possibly have this document? This is confidential. The bank managers promised us discretion. How do you know this?" I stood perfectly still under the crystal chandelier, the ambient light catching the sharp, tailored lines of my suit. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was not worthy of her love, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, magnificent sense of closure. I tilted my head, offering her a chilling, predatory smile that promised absolute ruin. "Mom, don't you understand how the subsidiary company operates?" "Did you truly not understand how my company operates, Mother?" I asked, translating the cold reality into words they could no longer deny. If a camera were positioned right now, it would drop low to the floor, angling sharply upward at me. From this low-angle perspective, the ceiling of the VIP room would seem to press down heavily on the people sitting opposite the marble table, while I towered over them, a monument of absolute, inescapable power. The lighting would cast long, sharp shadows behind me, visually confirming what they were just beginning to understand. They were entirely at my mercy. Obsidian FinTech does not simply analyze bad debt for academic purposes. I continued, my voice measured, steady, and utterly relentless. We acquire it. When traditional banking institutions are bleeding capital because clients like you default on multiple leveraged mortgages, they panic. They want those toxic assets off their ledgers immediately to satisfy their shareholders. So they bundle those non-performing loans together and sell them to firms like mine for pennies on the dollar. We buy the debt, and then we collect. My father was shaking his head, a slow mechanical movement that signaled his brain was failing to process the catastrophic implications of my words. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling violently against the dark wood of his chair. Your primary lender, the bank you relied on to fund your country club lifestyle, and Chloe's designer habits bundled a massive portfolio of their most toxic residential mortgages late last week, I explained, pacing slowly behind Harper. My footsteps were the only sound in the room, ticking like a countdown clock. They were desperate to offload the risk. My acquisitions team reviewed the portfolio over the weekend. We found your 3 defaulted mortgages buried right in the middle of it. I stopped pacing. I looked at the 3 members of my biological family. They looked like strangers, completely stripped of their arrogance, their elitism, and their cruel superiority. I authorized the purchase at 8 o'clock this morning. I stated the finality of the transaction, ringing like a death knell in the quiet room. The funds cleared at exactly 9. The transfer of deeds and promissory notes is complete. I leaned forward, placing my hands firmly on the table, forcing them to look at me. Do you understand what that means, Marcus? I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. It means the bank is no longer coming for your house. I am. I own your debt. I own the paper on the Buckhead estate. I own the walls, the roof, the pool you built for Chloe, and the driveway where you park your leased cars. I am the sole owner of your financial existence. The woman you just allowed this pathetic, broke little boy to extort is your only creditor. The silence that crashed down on the room was absolute. It was the silence of a kingdom turning to ash. My mother let out a small, broken whimper, her hands covering her mouth, as the reality of her total ruin finally took hold. She was not just losing her home. She had lost it to the daughter she had deemed socially unfit. My father stared blankly at the marble table, a man who had spent his entire life worshipping wealth, finally broken by it. Chloe sat perfectly still, tears carving tracks through her expensive makeup, the grand illusion of her superior life entirely evaporated. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted. It had been violently inverted, permanently locking them in a cage of their own making. And then the physical shockwave broke the spell. Trent, who had been pressing his back against his chair as if trying to melt into the upholstery, suddenly shot upward. His face was slick with a cold, terrified sweat. He realized with brutal clarity that there was no money to extort, no family fortune to steal, and no way out of his own $80,000 death sentence. He looked at me, his eyes wide with the panicked realization that he had just threatened a billionaire who held the entire room by the throat. He did not say a word. He did not look at Chloe. Trent simply spun on his heel, abandoning his fiancée, abandoning his fabricated billionaire persona, and bolted toward the heavy oak doors. The movement was a frantic blur, a violent streak of motion across the room that ended abruptly when he reached the exit. He did not care about optics or maintaining his aristocratic composure anymore. He only cared about self-preservation. Chloe, acting on blind reflex, reached out to grab his sleeve as he surged past her. "Trent, wait!" she sobbed, her fingers catching the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. "Trent, where are you going? What about us?" He did not slow down. He did not offer a single comforting word. Instead, he ripped his arm away with violent, unadulterated malice. The force of the motion threw Chloe completely off balance. She stumbled backward, her designer heels twisting painfully under her weight, and crashed hard onto the floor. She let out a sharp cry of pain, but Trent did not even glance back. He was completely feral. He reached the heavy oak doors and grabbed the brass handle, yanking it frantically. But before he could pull it open, a slender, impeccably manicured hand slammed flat against the wood, forcing it shut with a resounding crack. Harper stood there, a flawless, immovable barrier between Trent and the corridor. "Move!" Trent snarled. His face twisted into an ugly, desperate sneer. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his smartphone with trembling fingers, desperately trying to dial a number to get him out of this nightmare. "Get out of my way, you corporate attack dog, or I swear to God." "You swear what?" Trent Harper asked smoothly. Trent's composure shattered completely. The polished high society mask dissolved, revealing the ugly, venomous bigotry festering underneath. He whirled around to face my family, his eyes burning with toxic, racist fury. He was cornered, and like any cornered predator, he lashed out with whatever weapon he had left. "You think you have won?" He spat, his voice echoing with absolute disgust. "You think having a little bit of money makes you equal to us? You are nothing but a pathetic group of black social climbers playing dress-up. You bought a big house and some nice clothes, but you will never be elite. You are a joke. My family has history. We have pedigree. You are just newly wealthy trash trying to buy your way into a world that will never ever accept you." The silence following his outburst was deafening. My father looked physically sick. My mother covered her mouth, the reality of the man she had worshipped finally hitting her square in the chest. Chloe lay on the carpet, weeping hysterically, finally understanding that she was never a partner to him. She was just a mark, a pawn in a game she did not even know she was playing. Trent turned back to Harper, raising his phone. "I am calling the police. You are holding me against my will." Harper did not blink. She simply raised her foot and brought the stiletto heel of her Louboutin down with pinpoint precision. The sharp spike pierced the center of the phone's glass screen, shattering it instantly with a sharp, violent crunch. Trent recoiled in shock, dropping the destroyed device onto the floor. "You can try to run, Trent Harper," said her voice, dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "But I should warn you, my private security detail is currently stationed directly outside this door. If you attempt to leave before this meeting is officially concluded, they have explicit instructions to detain you until the authorities arrive to discuss your extensive wire fraud. Sit down." Trent stared at the crushed phone, then at Harper's cold, emerald eyes. He slowly backed away, sinking into a chair near the corner of the room, completely broken. I turned my attention back to the table. The destruction of Trent Blackwood was complete, but the real reckoning was just beginning. I watched as my father, the man who had demanded my absolute submission for my entire life, slowly lowered himself to the floor. My mother immediately followed, her knees hitting the carpet with a soft thud. They ignored Chloe weeping beside them. They ignored the shattered remains of their elite socialite dreams. Instead, Marcus and Vivian Williams knelt before me, looking up with eyes full of desperate, begging terror. "Maya!" My father pleaded, his voice cracking, completely devoid of pride. "Maya, please. You have to save us." My father's voice, usually a booming instrument of authority, was reduced to a wet, gravelly whimper. He looked up at me from his knees on the carpet, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkling around his collapsing frame. Beside him, my mother clawed at the fabric of my slacks, her manicured fingers desperate, her tear-stained face a mask of absolute terror. "Maya, please," she sobbed, abandoning every ounce of the haughty, aristocratic grace she had spent decades cultivating. "You cannot do this to us. We are your parents. We are your flesh and blood. You cannot put your own family on the street. We share the same name. We raised you. We are family." I looked down at them. If a camera were capturing this scene, it would execute a creeping, agonizingly slow push in on my face, blurring out the pathetic, weeping figures at my feet, until there was nothing left in focus but my cold, absolute stillness. I did not feel a single flicker of pity. I felt exactly nothing. "Family," I repeated. The word tasted metallic on my tongue. I let the silence stretch out, forcing them to marinate in their own desperation. I looked at Marcus, whose eyes were wide and begging. I looked at Vivian, whose hands were trembling as she reached for me again. I took a slow, deliberate step back, forcing her hands to fall empty into the air. "Do you remember what happened exactly 8 years ago, Marcus?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. I was 19 years old. I had just come to you terrified, explaining that I was dropping out of my business degree program to pursue a tech startup idea. I was asking for your guidance. I was asking for a fraction of the grace you showered on Chloe every single day of her life. My father swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor. "Maya, That was a long time ago. We were just trying to protect you. We wanted you to have a secure future. You wanted me to be a socially acceptable accessory, I corrected him, my tone sharpening into a razor edge. And when I refused to play the part, you cut me off. You gave me 1 hour to pack my bags. You froze my bank accounts. You stood in the foyer of that exact house in Buckhead, the one I now own, and you looked me dead in the eyes. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to his, forcing him to hold my gaze. Do you remember what you said to me, Marcus? I whispered. My mother let out a small, terrified gasp, her hands covering her mouth, because she remembered perfectly. You pointed at the front door, and you said failures do not belong in this family. You told me I was a disgrace. You told me I would end up begging on the streets. I stood back up, adjusting the cuffs of my suit jacket with deliberate, agonizing slowness. Well, I am not the one begging, am I said. Maya, we were wrong, my mother cried out, crawling forward slightly. We were so wrong. We made a terrible mistake. But you are our daughter. You are so successful now. $2 billion, Maya. This house, this debt, it is nothing to you. It is pocket change. You could wipe it away with a single stroke of a pen. You could save us. You have the power to fix all of this. I do have the power, I agreed, my voice perfectly level. And I have exactly the same amount of compassion for you today as you had for me when I was 19. The color drained completely from their faces. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The daughter they had discarded had returned not as a savior, but as an executioner. I am not wiping the debt, I stated, the finality of the words echoing off the mahogany walls. I am not giving you a grace period. I am not refinancing your loans, and I am certainly not paying for my sister's fraudulent wedding. I turned my head slightly. Harper stepped forward. She reached into the briefcase one last time and withdrew a thick, professionally bound legal document. She placed it dead center on the marble table, right next to the shattered remains of Trent's phone. She uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen and laid it meticulously across the cover page. I looked back down at the two people kneeling on the floor. That is a voluntary transfer of deed and a total asset forfeiture agreement. I explained, my voice devoid of any emotion. It transfers the Buckhead property, the remaining equity in your investment portfolios, and the ownership of your vehicles directly to Obsidian FinTech to cover the balance of your defaulted loans. My father stared at the document as if it were a loaded weapon. You cannot be serious, he choked out. You are taking everything. You are leaving us with nothing. I am leaving you with the exact same foundation you gave me, I replied. Nothing. I tapped my index finger against the edge of the marble table. You have exactly 60 seconds to get off your knees, pick up that pen, and sign this agreement. I told them, my eyes locking onto theirs with absolute unyielding authority. Sign this, or tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, my firm will execute a hostile foreclosure. The sheriff will arrive at the Buckhead estate, your belongings will be thrown out on the street for the entire neighborhood to see, and I will personally ensure the financial press knows exactly why. My father stared at the document, his eyes frantically scanning the dense legal text. His lips moved silently as he read the stipulations, his face twisting in a portrait of pure horror. This was not a simple transfer of deed. It was a comprehensive, inescapable financial restructuring of his entire existence. Read Clause 4. Marcus Harper instructed, her voice entirely devoid of sympathy. You are turning over the titles to the leased Mercedes and the Porsche. You are immediately liquidating your equity in the country club. You will sell every piece of designer jewelry and high-end art in that house to cover the arrears. The remaining deficiency balance will be converted into a structured loan held exclusively by Obsidian FinTech, calculated at a strict market interest rate of 8%. My mother gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. But how will we pay that? She wailed, her voice shrill and panicked. We have no income if the firm is failing. We cannot afford a monthly payment on top of everything else. You will do exactly what normal people do, Vivian, I said, looking down at her weeping form. You will get a job, both of you. You will clock in, you will work 40 hours a week, and you will send a sizable portion of your paycheck to my accounts department on the first of every single month. If you are one day late, the eviction is immediate. There are no grace periods. There are no extensions. You will work to pay me back for the rest of your natural lives. The view tightened entirely on my father's hand. His skin was pale, his knuckles white with agonizing strain. He reached out and picked up the heavy gold fountain pen Harper had laid on the table. The nib hovered over the signature line, shaking so violently that a single drop of black ink splattered onto the pristine white paper. Next to the ink, a single heavy teardrop fell from my mother's cheek, splashing against the polished marble table and fracturing into tiny bitter fragments. With a ragged, defeated exhale, Marcus Williams signed his name. He signed away his empire, his pride, and his freedom. He handed the pen to my mother, who sobbed openly, her shoulders heaving as she scrawled her name beneath his. Harper neatly collected the documents, snapping them back into her briefcase with a crisp final click that sounded like a prison cell locking shut. Just as the latch secured, a timid knock sounded at the heavy oak doors. The restaurant manager stepped tentatively into the VIP room, holding a sleek, black leather checkbook. He looked highly uncomfortable, clearly sensing the radioactive tension lingering in the air, but duty compelled him forward. "Excuse me, Mr. Williams," the manager murmured, keeping his eyes politely averted from the crying women on the floor. "I have the bill for the private room and the catering." He placed the leather folder on the table. It fell open slightly, revealing the bold printed total: $4,200. For a family that had just signed away their last remaining assets to avoid absolute ruin, it might as well have been $4 million. My father stared at the bill, his face utterly blank. He had no cash. His accounts were frozen. The grand facade was entirely dead. I buttoned the center button of my suit jacket and picked up my clutch. I stepped around the table and linked my arm through Harper's. We stood together, a portrait of absolute, untouchable power. I looked down at the three shattered people sitting in the wreckage of their own making. "You arranged this little extortion party," I said, my voice echoing lightly in the cavernous room. "You ordered the vintage champagne. You booked the private suite. Therefore, you will pay for it. Swipe whatever credit cards you have left. Max out the very last fraction of your credit limits. Because by tomorrow morning, those cards will be declined everywhere." I turned my back on them, walking toward the heavy mahogany doors. As Harper and I stepped out into the brightly lit, bustling corridor of the restaurant, the doors swung shut behind us. Just before the hydraulic hinges sealed the room entirely, the sound spilled out into the hallway. It was the distinct, violently sharp sound of a crystal wine glass shattering against a marble wall, followed immediately by the desperate, ugly sound of my mother wailing. If this were a film, a rapid series of wipe transitions would dictate the frantic rhythm of the next 72 hours, illustrating a complete and absolute societal collapse. First, the camera would cut to the neon-soaked exterior of an upscale Atlanta nightclub at 2 o'clock in the morning. Red and blue police lights would flash violently against the wet pavement, illuminating a crowd of gawkers. 2 federal agents would be seen hauling Trent out of the VIP entrance. His hands were securely cuffed behind his back. His custom-tailored shirt was ripped at the collar, and his face was a mask of inebriated, desperate panic. Local reporters shoved cameras and microphones into his face as he was shoved into the back of a squad car. Trent and his fabricated aristocratic family had finally made the front page of the financial journals, but the headlines were strictly about extensive wire fraud, catastrophic bankruptcy, and a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme that had just imploded. The next sharp transition would wipe directly to Chloe. Her grand, heavily publicized society wedding was officially canceled in absolute, unprecedented disgrace. The high-end vendors pulled out immediately, the massive deposits were forfeited, and the exclusive guest list of Buckhead elites quickly turned her into their favorite cautionary tale. The camera would push in on her, sitting alone in her darkened bedroom, the harsh blue light of her laptop screen illuminating her tear-streaked face. Her perfectly curated social media empire, built entirely on the illusion of superiority and wealth, was burning to the ground in real time. I had ensured the unvarnished truth about Trent's criminal fraud, and the Williams family's sudden devastating foreclosure circulated quietly but efficiently through the right social channels. The comment sections on her glamorous engagement photos were flooded with mockery, cruel jokes, and vicious upper-class gossip. The elite friends she had cultivated suddenly pretended they had never met her. With trembling fingers, Chloe frantically clicked through her settings, locking her account, setting everything to private, and effectively erasing her digital existence in a desperate bid to hide from the suffocating humiliation. By Friday afternoon, she was completely out of options and entirely alone. My phone vibrated on my heavy mahogany desk at Obsidian FinTech. The caller ID flashed Chloe's name. I sat back in my leather chair and watched the screen light up. I felt an icy, profound satisfaction as she called back a second time, then a third. I let every single call go straight to voicemail. A few minutes later, the notification pinged. I listened to her sobbing, incoherent audio message. She was begging me to call her back, begging me for a loan to escape the city, begging for the sisterly bond she had spent 2 decades systematically destroying. I did not call her back. Instead, I recorded a single voice message and sent it directly to her phone. You chose a con artist over your own blood because he wore a nice suit and promised you an elite illusion, I said into the microphone, my tone measured, clinical, and entirely devoid of empathy. You spent your entire life believing you were superior because of the money sitting in our parents' bank accounts. Now the money is gone, the fiancé is in federal custody, and you have absolutely nothing left but yourself. You are exactly what you always accused me of being. Enjoy the reality check, Chloe. Do not contact me again. I hit send, navigated to my security settings, and permanently blocked her number. With my sister effectively cut out of my orbit, my focus shifted to the architects of this entire misery. Marcus and Vivian Williams were about to experience a harsh, unforgiving introduction to the real world. The Buckhead estate was officially seized by the end of the week. Their luxury cars were repossessed from the driveway. Stripped of their generational wealth, their country club memberships, and their arrogant pride, my parents had to move into a cramped, poorly insulated 2-bedroom apartment in a loud working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. For the first time in their 60 years of life, they had to set alarm clocks, study public transit bus routes, and figure out how to survive on a meager hourly wage. The image on the screen was grainy, the colors washed out by the cheap lens of a standard security camera. The wide-angle perspective completely distorted the edges of the frame, but the subjects laboring in the center of the feed were unmistakable. Marcus Williams, a man who had not worn anything off the rack in 3 decades, was currently drowning in a faded, oversized gray t-shirt. He was wrestling with a battered, gas-powered push mower across a patch of overgrown, yellowing weeds in front of their new, rented duplex. The machine sputtered and choked, emitting thick puffs of exhaust that made him cough violently. He yanked the pull cord again and again, his shoulders slumping with a profound, exhausting defeat under the blazing heat of the afternoon sun. A few yards away, captured in the lower left quadrant of the feed, Vivian was on her hands and knees. She was vigorously scrubbing the grime off the concrete front steps with a stiff, bristled brush and a bucket of soapy water. Her weekly designer manicures were a thing of the distant past. She wore thick yellow rubber gloves, pausing only to wipe the sweat and tears from her face with the back of her forearm. To afford the brutal monthly payments dictated by our restructuring agreement, they had been forced to immediately liquidate every remaining luxury they possessed. The private chef, the driver, and the landscaping crew had been unceremoniously fired the morning after our meeting. Now, stripped of their wealth and the protective shield of the Buckhead gates, they were learning exactly how the other half lived. The ambient noise of the neighborhood filtered through the audio feed. There were no quiet, manicured lawns here. Instead, there was the sound of distant sirens, stray dogs barking, and heavy traffic rolling past their unsecured front door. For my entire life, my parents had weaponized the concept of black excellence. They used it as a bludgeon to enforce perfection, to demand social dominance, and to justify their sneering elitism toward anyone who did not share their tax bracket. They believed excellence was defined by the logo on their cars, the zip code on their mortgage, and the people they could afford to look down upon. Now that grand illusion was dead and buried. They were reduced to the very working-class existence they had spent their entire lives mocking. They were learning the bitter, agonizing lesson of humility, one back-breaking hour at a time. I watched them through the live feed on my iPad, sitting perfectly still. I did not feel a rush of vindictive triumph. There was no arrogant smirk on my face, no warm glow of satisfaction in my chest. There was only a vast glacial silence. The emotional tether that had once tied me to them, the desperate childhood need for their approval, had been completely severed. I was looking at two strangers performing yard work. They were no longer the terrifying giants of my youth. They were just two exhausted tenants trying to make their monthly rent. I watched my father finally get the mower started, the harsh vibration rattling his arms as he pushed it forward. I watched my mother scrub the concrete until her shoulders shook with quiet, unrelenting sobs. Then I simply pressed the power button. The screen went black, instantly erasing them from my view. I set the tablet face down on the small side table next to my chair, closing the door on the past forever. I shifted my attention and turned my head toward the future. The room I was sitting in was softly lit, smelling faintly of medical antiseptic and lavender. The steady, rhythmic, rushing sound of a fetal heartbeat filled the quiet space, echoing loudly from the speakers of a state-of-the-art medical monitor. Harper lay on the examination table next to me, her pristine blouse pushed up. The ultrasound technician moved the wand gently across the clear gel on her stomach, bringing a blurry but unmistakable image into focus on the screen above us. The rhythmic, rapid thudding of our child's heartbeat filled the small medical room, a sound so profoundly pure and entirely unburdened by the heavy generational expectations I had carried my entire life. I reached out and laced my fingers through Harper's, feeling the warm, solid reality of the family I had actually chosen. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, not from sorrow, but from a fierce, overwhelming joy. This was real. This was mine. The sterile walls of the clinic transitioned smoothly into the expansive, sunlit living area of our penthouse. The view glided gently across the open floor plan, highlighting the warm oak floors, the carefully curated artwork, and the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The afternoon light poured into the room, bathing everything in a rich, golden glow. It was a space defined by airlight and absolute freedom, a stark contrast to the dark, suffocating, perfectly staged corridors of the Buckhead mansion I had left behind. I stood near the glass, holding a mug of herbal tea, watching the city move below me. The camera pushed in slowly, capturing the quiet, relaxed posture of my shoulders and the genuine, unforced happiness radiating from my face. The exhausting decade-long journey from being the designated family scapegoat to becoming the untouchable architect of my own destiny was finally complete. For years, I had believed that confronting my parents would require explosive arguments, shattered glass, and dramatic, tearful showdowns. I thought that true closure meant forcing them to acknowledge my pain and admit their failures. I was completely wrong. The absolute greatest revenge was not anger. It was not screaming until my throat was raw. It was stepping back, removing my financial and emotional safety net, and letting them drown in the deep, turbulent waters of their own making. I did not destroy the Williams family legacy. Their insatiable greed, their blinding arrogance, and their desperate obsession with a fabricated social image did that for me. I simply stopped paying the premiums on their illusions. While they exhausted themselves trying to maintain a facade of superiority, I had quietly built an empire of substance. I kept moving forward, leaving them to sweep the concrete steps of their own consequences. Harper walked into the frame, stepping up behind me and wrapping her arms gently around my waist. She rested her hands on the slight growing curve of her stomach, and I leaned back against her shoulder, exhaling a breath I felt like I had been holding since childhood. I placed my hands over hers. We had built this life together, brick by brick, entirely on a foundation of mutual respect, brutal honesty, and unwavering partnership. I looked down at her hands, thinking about the tiny, blurry life we had just seen on the monitor. This child would never know the bitter, freezing sting of conditional affection. They would never be weaponized against a sibling, never be told they were a fundamental disappointment for pursuing their own unique passions, and they would certainly never be treated as a prop for a cocktail party. The cycle of emotional extortion ended with me. We were going to raise our baby in an environment of absolute unconditional love. They would be allowed to fail to dream and to exist exactly as they were. I turned my gaze away from the beautiful skyline and looked directly into the center of the camera lens. The view pushed in closer, holding steady on the absolute unbreakable certainty in my eyes. They say blood is thicker than water. People use that tired phrase to chain you to toxic environments, to demand your blind loyalty even when you receive absolutely none in return. But they forget the most critical rule of survival. If that blood is toxic, you have to cut it off to save yourself. I amputated the infection, and in doing so I finally learned how to breathe. I offered a bright, triumphant smile, the expression of a woman who had finally won her absolute freedom. Now, if you will excuse me, my wife is waiting to have dinner. A real dinner.